kind of turban that was traditionally worn by the Akali Sikhs. The Akali were a group within the Sikh faith who combines spiritualism with a role as the warrior and protector of the Sikh faith. And there a lot more information on the display panels around on the other side, sort of going into a bit more detail about who the Akali Sikhs were. What I want to point out today is that this turban is a really good example of how the Sikh, this type of turban has a very long tradition. It was worn by the Akali Sikhs right back from the 1600s, but it's still worn by Akali Sikhs today. You can see in pictures on the panels around there's some pictures of Akali Sikhs wearing turbans in the late 19th century and still being worn today. And this turban here in the case really illustrates that continuity between history and culture today. The metal ornaments that you see here are all probably mid to late 19th century, but the turban that they're now mounted on was dating from 2010. So the link between the past and the present. The metal ornaments that you see here were originally found on the turban, the second turban that's on display in this gallery over here. And they certainly were mounted on that turban in 1894. What I want to talk about is really how we went from the objects mounted on here, the process that we went through very closely in partnership with the representatives from the Akali Sikh community. You see now and here are mounted on the original turban over here. So it was 2005 the object came into conservation in that state, and it came in because it was obviously in the store and it was really falling apart. Pieces were dropping off it, and the curator responsible for the collection was very concerned about its condition. But we have to confess that we knew very, very little about what the object was. It hadn't even been registered into the museum's collection, so it was a sort of unnumbered object that had a brief description, Sikh turban, and that was about it. So right from the very beginning of the project, I was presented with this object and thinking, what is it? And what should I do to it? And I need to find some more information. So right at that very beginning process, I started consulting with G.O.A.T here. So perhaps I really wanted to know, first of all, what it is. Is it an ordinary object? Is it a unique object, a commonplace object? Is it an object of historical, cultural interest to them? Is it worth preserving? And what should it look like? What did it originally look like? How were the metal bits positioned? How much fabric was there? So those are the kind of questions that I was asking, and I thought I'd ask you again. So Pamjit, what did you tell me when I first asked you what it was and whether it's worth saving?
Hi everyone, I'm Pamjit Singh, as Monique said. It was instantly recognisable. I've been studying the Akali Nihangs for the past 2 decades. I know I don't look that young, but it's a turban that, when the V&A have a couple, the Leeds, Royal Armouries, they have one, and there are 1 or 2 others dotted around the country. But they were really used as exhibition items back in sort of under the British Raj, Calcutta and other places. They had these colonial exhibitions, and municipal committees from around the country, especially from Amritsar, would send off their wares, examples of handicrafts and artwork and so on. And what the Amritsar committee tended to do, and people from Lahore would they send off examples of Sikh warrior turbans such as this, which gave a good example of sort of traditional folk culture at the time. Over time, these objects would sort of make their way to the UK, housed in institutions such as this. And if you look, I don't think Monique mentioned this, but the original turban, when it first came to the UK, looked something like that. And that's a photograph from an exhibition in 1899, when it was at the Brackerton House in Whitehall. So that came about by chance, chance research after before we'd seen what it really looked like. I was later moved that the turban was the turban of an Akali warrior from the 19th century. Now, Akali means immortal, and the Akalis were a high-ranking element within the Sikh, the traditional Sikh armies. And as a traditional Sikh army, these Sikh armies, before the advent of the British Raj, the Sikhs joined the British Indian Army. So if you like, these warriors date back to the 17th century, but their actual traditions go back much further into antiquity. So we started off with I knew it was an Akali turban because there's this long blue flag. Well, we started off with that actually. We saw that there was all this turban material falling down, but there was an idea that at the top there would be something that comes down possibly. So it was a turban of a Sikh warrior, and the Akali element didn't come back until we found that photograph, minor French. This particular size, height, wasn't what the original warriors wore. This is related particularly to the 19th century. And the reason why it's so tall, it's almost like a sign of defiance, if you like, because the Nihangs, if I go back in history, the British were beginning the experiment with India, creating a Raj with the East India Company in the 1760s. Around about the same time, the Sikhs were fighting off the Afghans. And so you've got, at the same time, the British creating an empire in the east, the Sikhs creating an empire in the north. And they were both on the hunt for territory, acquisitions, state, wealth, growth, and the key target for them at the beginning, or the turn of the 18th century, was Delhi, the sort of centre, the capital of Hindustan, which was ruled by the Mughal power. The British happened to get there first. They'd signed a treaty with the Sikhs, and they lived in peace for about 20-30 years. The old guard Sikhs, the Akali Nihangs, didn't like that treaty, and they rebelled against the Sikh kings who were signing treaties with the British. because they knew the British were an acquisitional sort of power, just like they were, so they were worried about the British would usurp them at some stage, and they continually used to cross into British territory, saying we need to visit our religious sites, and this caused all sorts of trouble between the British and the Akali warriors. Now, this came to a head in around about the 1840s when the British and Sikhs eventually went to war. The Akali warriors hated the British hated the Akali warriors, and when eventually the British won and annexation occurred and they added Punjab to the British Indian territories, the Nihangs themselves were hunted down and shot, and they were treated like bandits, highwaymen and the like. So only a few who were willing to put down their weapons and to survive in a sort of a docile state, if you like, as priests and sort of lay people were allowed to survive. The hard sort of hardened warriors, photograph which painted with this. Only the hardened warriors sort of didn't lay down their arms. They were pushed out of Punjab and they were scattered to other parts of India. This painting represents an Akali warrior in independent Punjab, pre-Sikh, pre-British Raj. So you can see there's sort of an example of the conical turban, and the elements there, the sort of quoits and the daggers are decorated in gold, which shows the level of prosperity that was evident in Punjab at the time. Can I bring that back and get to the next page? And here's a true fighting warrior painting in Lahore Museum. It's done around about 1860, but represents the sort of elite fighting force amongst the Akalis, the Pujungis, the snake-like warriors, because of the way they fought in battle. And you can see their arms to the teeth. And the British, who were really interested in maintaining law and order, being the paramount power, despised these guys who would come over to their territories without permission, and so you can see they didn't like the idea of marauding hordes of horsemen, totally armed to the teeth and bristling with weapons, crossing into their territories. So there was this intense struggle just after annexation in 1849, where they tried to stamp out the Nihang influence. And the importance of the Nihangs were they were the ones who initiated Sikhs into the Khalsa fraternity, which was the military brotherhood. So the British knew if you take care of these, you're going to have a pacified community. And there's no spite or anything. We know this is the way empires work. So it's just the telling of history. We need to know it. You can see this turban here. It's much, well, not much smaller, but it's significantly smaller than this turban. And so what we're seeing as the empire is carrying on, the turbans became larger as a sign of defiance. Under the British Raj, in the first 2 decades, to stamp down the authority, the British officers expected people to bow and salam if a sahib went past. And we've got accounts of this and records of this. The Nihangs would tie turbans like this to prevent them having to do that. So there's a way of getting out of a sign of defiance, if you like, without being overtly defiant. There's one instance of a Nihang in about 1858, it's recorded in the missionary papers. He got a slap on the face from a British officer because he didn't bow. And that Nihang warrior, Akali Nihang warrior, would later on in 1864, at a fair in Punjab, killed a missionary because he just came back to him, I was going to take revenge. And he came back to him, he ended up killing this very important German missionary, Mr. Janvier. So, there's this whole love-hate relationship between the Nihangs and the British. So the size of the turban was a 19th century manifestation, if you like. Traditionally, they'd be much smaller, but they'd still have the same emblems. And if you go through, you can see these ascending quoits. And the quoits are an ancient weapon used by, shown in mythological paintings, carried by Vishnu and Krishna, who's an avatar of Vishnu, to kill their enemies, to take off heads with one throw. They're basically throwing knives, circular throwing knives, if you like, unlike a normal knife, you throw a knife, if it hits the point, you can kill somebody. With this, it doesn't matter which point it hits, it will do damage, and it ricochets as well. So they were used to attack large clusters of people. If you were there, you're my opponents. It's being spun on the finger and then ejected, and then it would hit you, go into you, dash you, and you're there to break up the vanguards of an opposing force. It was also capable of taking off the leg of a horse. And there's a really interesting incident at one of the battles of the First Anglo-Sikh War in February 1846. Two Nahuns, bristling with weapons, totally covered with knives and daggers, are captured, and they've got all these quoits in them. They're stripped down, and as they're being marched off to be taken to sort of prison and sent to Delhi or wherever, one of the British officers picks up a quoit and spins it around to them as a sign of, well, how do you use this? I've seen you throw it in battle. Couldn't communicate, but he just did that. And a bit of a gesture. And then Nahang first of all ignored him, and then one of the Indian soldiers, the British officer, sort of goaded the Nahang to say, you don't know, do you? And then he took it off him, and he started to spin it around his finger, looking for a target. And 60 yards away, on a little mound, was the officer's favourite goat, his milk goat. And he ejected the quoit with such force that it almost severed the head of the goat. So these are really, really dangerous weapons that go back into ancient times, ancient India. If you look at the front, that central totemic emblem signifies the Gata. Now there's two meanings for the word Gata. Gata means entrance, and Gata means ground, it means the ground, separation. So the two things, one is to say that these are the technical things. And that's to say that these components were manufactured organization, and the warriors and the independents of Krishna were involved in the part where that's the it's an emblem of extreme power and relative warrior related to in the symbol itself, made up of presence. That tells its own story, a story of ancient so it's again very much Indian cosmology and how it is about creation, something of Shiv Shakti, which is out of the scope of the book. But we have enormous meaning to the populace of India, because the army that the Muhammad's fronted and led were the people's army, and they had to recruit branch of Indian society. And so, like the Hindus of India didn't have just one belief, they had many nationalites, Shivites, people in India are those Hindus that those who took arms as a knowledge of the right, or those who believe in Islam. So you have vegetarians and eaters, so you have to sort of use symbology to attract people to your cause. And in this you've got symbology that connects to Vishnu, Vaishnavite followers, and also to Shivite followers. If we go a bit further up, you see an interesting development. At this level you've got this interesting headpiece, which it's a quoit with a double-edged turban at the top. And it's slightly modified. It's got a little sort of, it's like a pin, it's got a bar at the back. And that was one modified version of a turban badge. And then when Mr. Redway going to turn up on the descent?
Yes.
When is that? 16th of April. We used to talk about Thomas Redway, descendant on the founder of the regiment. So in this turban, you've got aspects of defiance, you've got aspects of antiquity, you've got weapons, and it's deadly, and you've got this sort of opening into British Raj where you're modifying them. And where did the Redway regiment get the inspiration from? Which was the Cutting Knives. Now the Cutting Knives are taking that inspiration back and putting it into their own turban. So it's also very much folk art, folk lore, and at the end of the day, this object
very poor state of condition. It's just falling apart, creating dust and fragments all over the place. The floor where it was found today is still made of little bits of the turtle. I wanted to know first of all whether it was okay to take the metal pieces off the original turtle, and whether that would be an acceptable course of action. It certainly made conservation much easier. And there are instances where the act of placing objects together is carried out as part of their spiritual or religious role. And I didn't want to separate the pieces out if that was going to be seen as the wrong thing to do. First step is to take the metal elements off the original and sew them. So they were cleaned in different ways. Passed around a few photographs just so they show the original condition of them. Condition and the textile is 3,500 years old and it's in better condition. So what is it about this turtle that has caused it to be so degraded? First of all, I thought it had been exposed to lots of light or acidic vapours or something like that. But the level of degradation goes right through the whole layers of the fabric. So I wanted to look for chemical reasons why it's degrading, and started to look at whether it was something to do with anything added in terms of the dye and the finishes as it caused the degradation. So we had quite a lot of analysis work done. Firstly, analysing the dyes, and the first thing we discovered was that it contained indigo, which is slightly surprising because it doesn't have to do with the next thing that we found was very high levels of iron. And this immediately told me that probably has been dyed with black dye that is produced by the combination of iron and tan. This is quite a common dye, black. And so the likelihood is that the fabric for the original turtle was dyed with a combination of indigo and black dye. The aim of it to make a very dark blue, because in fact to dye dark blue with just indigo is very, very expensive, made a very expensive cloth. And so usually often we found that a dark blue was made up of a it goes this browny black rather than blue flash. And so I think probably the original colour of this turban would be a very dark blue. And that's one of the reasons why you can see the centre of the new turban has been tied using blue. And it's been the fire in the black dye that's caused the difference that it's really speeded up natural processes of degradation. Whether this was actually worth doing. And also, these processes, they might slow down degradation. They don't reverse it. There's not actually any stronger. So, in a way, I came to think that maybe I would, this would be worth make it stronger by doing this. So, the next approach I would do is actually sticking and holding it together. Wrapping the new fabric around it, adhering it onto a support fabric. That's an approach that we often take in textile conservation. You could have on one hand all the layers of fabric away from the original core that it's wrapped around, wrapped it onto something more uniform. It's really inexpensive, it's a huge treatment. Then I came back to Andrews and said, well, how important is this to the actual targets? And is it would be a concern if we took the metal pieces off and either stored them separately or maybe on another support structure? So that was very much a process that we had to take together with the curatorial team and with Bridget. His knowledge of what the turban meant to the pharmacy, whether that was an approach that would be acceptable. And together we decided that conservation is about preserving and nature of the object and its entities. We don't actually have to conserve each element of it or all the original materials. And that there are ones replacement is actually very valid.
Untold Women.
Untold Women. So we did this. We basically came to the conclusion that it seemed a shame to take mechanisms from schools, and there's a series of points, individual points, and individual elements. They were interesting, but it was really as an assemblage together on the term that made this piece unique.
To ensure that it was done as accurately and authentically as possible. So we worked together very closely, myself, Meta's the two of us, and the whole team actually making this experience. It was a great opportunity. And what we did first of all was to, inside the original tome is a wooden cone. You can see it in the X-rays. Just in the top of it. I didn't want to unwrap all the old fabric from this and reuse the tone. I think it just effectively destroyed the original tone. So I started off by making a new concrete support using fabric in sort of pattern shape. So the same structure using the X-rays from the original, making them exactly the same shape. Then we used using our photograph. Started tying at the top, wound the fabric round it, bottom, back up to the top, round it. We kept on working both with the photographs but also with the points themselves, so we knew how much diameter of the toilet should be. So once we'd wound the fabric, then we